Picture this. 1 second you are relaxed, having a beautiful day, when the ground starts to shake. You feel the ground move and you struggle to stay upright. As you run, you feel the horror and fear start to crawl right over you. You see buildings collapse all around you. You fear a building will fall on top of you, crushing you to pulp. You are escorted by police as you watch even your own house fall down. No, you scream. It's not. But you know exactly what it is. It is an earthquake. Not only did the city change that day, but so did you. That is how many people suffered in earthquakes. You would be lucky, but you know that countless others that were less lucky have been trapped inside the rubble. But this particular earthquake takes place in New Zealand, Napier.
The city of Napier is 300 kilometres north of the capital city of Wellington on the east coast. Hastings is 20 kilometres south of Napier. On the morning of February the 3rd, 1931, at 10:48, the district was shaken by an earthquake of the magnitude of 7 3/4 on the Richter scale. The epicenter being 20 kilometres northwest of Napier. This was the first earthquake of a high magnitude in a populous area since the European settlement of New Zealand. The business area of Napier was badly damaged in the first quake and subsequently by fire. Only about 12 of these buildings didn't have to be demolished. On the right, the lower 2 floors of a hotel, a brick building with some steel beams. Fortunately, the naval sloop HMS Veronica had berthed in Napier 3 hours before the quake, and within 9 minutes radioed details and requirements to the naval base at Auckland. 3.5 hours later, 2 cruisers with doctors, nurses, medical supplies and rescue equipment left Auckland. Bread was baked on the all-night journey to Napier, where the cruisers arrived the next morning. Most of the damage was done by fire. It started in 2 pharmacies with naked gas flames and, of course, much inflammable liquid. At the hospitals, all wards were damaged, and a temporary hospital was established in this park. 1% of the population, some 250 people, were killed. Only 2% were cot cases. Many hundreds, of course, were slightly injured.
Many people witnessed this event, but today one survivor in particular has come to share his story.
We come out for playtime, and bang, she hit. It was such a huge shock, you know. The ground was rolling like a big roll, like the sea waves. And as the ground went at the top, it would open up a big crack like that, you see. And as they went down, the ground would close up again. When we would hang on to a fence, and Dad, all of us kids hang on to a fence in case we dropped down one of these cracks. That's how bad it was. There was a bit of a hill beside the school where a big rock came rolling down, cleaned up the girls' toilet, and crashed over into the gully. And so we went home, and I remember as we were going home, the neighbour, Mr. Hayes, he was riding his horse. He had half a dozen dogs, and another big shake came, and the wave was coming up and down like this. You see the man on the horse, then all he sees is his hat. And he got down the bottom of the wave, and then this man and the horse and dogs, I don't know how the horses didn't scare and run away, but he must have had it under control. Well, Dad put the tent up. We lived in the tent for about 3 weeks, I think, before he was going to go back in the house. Oh, well, in Napier itself, well, the cars built down cracks.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were driving along, and then the next thing the road opened up and they just drove into a crack. It got flattened, and the gas mains burst. They did the old town gas, you know, the gasometers and gas works, and that burst, and Napier burnt out. I remember I was sitting on a loo one time, the old outside loo, you know, we didn't have flush toilets or anything those days, and another big shake coming. I remember being thrown out, my pants around my ankles and bare bum.
On the following day, 6% of the population were taken away by car, and eventually half of the population, mostly women and children, were taken south. Fortunately, the stocks of petrol were not destroyed. House damage was mostly confined to chimneys, but owing to the large number of subsequent quakes, people preferred not to live indoors. The water pumping station was damaged, the reservoir was cracked, and the water supply failed entirely 1 hour after the quake. One of the great problems was sewerage. The pumps were restarted on the third day, but it was 6 weeks before water and sewerage services were restored to the majority of houses.
What happens next, you ask? Well, then there are a series of smaller quakes called aftershocks. Although they still pack a punch, the result of the Napier earthquake and its smaller aftershocks caused a Horiri lagoon to lose 2,130 hectares of water. This earthquake disturbed large quantities of rock, and as these pieces resettle, a massive 597 aftershocks occurred all throughout the end of February, destroying all of the crumbling buildings left. If it couldn't get worse during the aftershocks, fires roared alive, consuming the rubble and burning people trapped inside. The situation was so severe, King George himself sent out a telegram to the Governor-General of New Zealand asking to know more about it. It took 2 years to declare the city reborn, and a much longer time to shake the impact done. Many plans for buildings were abandoned due to the fact that this happened during the Great Depression. So many workers were unable to gather enough materials as it was too expensive.
The Northern Highway. This damage was not typical of the damage to most of the Hawke's Bay roads. The causeway had been built across mudflats and failed largely through lack of lateral support. It was 9 days before a car reached Napier over this highway. The railway to the north had been in use for only a few years and was restored many weeks later. The railway south to Wellington was in working order 2.5 days after the quake. The post office had suffered no structural damage, and when the fire was discovered, it could have been extinguished with 1 bucket of water, had there been one. Telegrams were sent by aeroplane for the first week. In addition to the official radio transmitters, the New Zealand amateur transmitters did sterling work. Lime mortar was used in brickwork instead of cement mortar. For reinforced concrete instead of good clean sand, limestone sand had been used which reacted chemically with the cement. No cases were seen of reinforcing rods pulling through concrete. The Navy demolished dangerous walls, cleared the streets, took charge of food supplies, helped to restore the sewerage pumps, and generally did much to raise the morale of the people. Very typical of the damaged buildings was the collapse of the outside walls because they were not adequately tied in. The Technical College was a brick building of 2 floors without any concrete columns. There were 300 boys in this school at this time, and many of them were thrown out of the building. In one part, the roof collapsed within 3 feet of the upper floor. One boy was rescued the following day, not much hurt, quite cheerful, but very hungry. At the Napier Hospital, no patients were injured, although all the wards were damaged. Unfortunately, the nurses' home, a 4-storied brick building, collapsed, and many nurses who'd been on night duty were killed while asleep. In Hastings also, a temporary hospital was established, and on the day of the quake, 66 operations were performed with full facilities. The building here tilted because after completion some of the foundations were dug out for the installation of garages. This cliff was of strong limestone, and the sea reached this wall at high tide prior to the quake. Fortunately, no one was on that portion of the highway at the time. The uplift was about 2 meters. The building on this corner is still in use today. The one of 3 floors further along had to be demolished. This building had to be refaced with a new front. Supply of electricity from the state system was restored 31 hours after the quake at a lower voltage. In Hastings, 20 kilometers south of Napier, the Methodist Church. Here, the electricity generating station was restarted 1.5 hours after the quake. Water was pumped and fires were extinguished. 10 hours later, another severe shake put the generator out of action and fire spread through one block. A view of the main business street. 200 premises altogether had to be demolished. The moral is, don't run out on the sidewalks during a quake. One man was buried under a heavy concrete beam and rescued by the only salvage truck in the city. Several well-designed, well-constructed buildings, both in brick and reinforced concrete, not shown in this film, suffered little or no damage. A hotel of 5 floors, built floor by floor without engineering advice, collapsed, as you see. At the first shake, the front wall fell out, and in subsequent heavy shakes caught fire, and finally, a heap of rubble. This modern building was damaged by the collapse of the building next to it. The 2-floored building in the center is still in use today. Another view of the remains of the 5-floored hotel. The clock tower of the Hastings post office was 20 meters high. As you see, it dragged much of the building down with it. The heavy bells of the clock were hurled 30 meters out into the street. In the first mail delivery after the quake, the income tax demands were sent out. There was no earthquake building code in force in New Zealand at the time of the disaster. The faith of the people in the district is shown by the 2 new cities which arose from the ruins of the old, constructed to a rigid building code.
I remember those old times, but things are changing, the planet is changing, and it is our duty to protect it, at all costs.